Hey everybody, how's it going? It's Zach Grant with the University of Illinois Extension and the Urban Ag Connect vlog series. Coming at you once again from the South Suburban Cook Urban Ag Demonstration Site, or SoSUCO. We sure did get a lot of rain yesterday, and there's more in the forecast. Unfortunately, we've gone, well, maybe it's a bit of a mixed bag, right? It's been a very dry season for the most part, although we've kind of caught up with our water year here recently. We're about back to normal. I know parts of northern Illinois have been in kind of an extended moderate drought. So it's good to get rain, but we don't want to get this much rain. So we're forecasted to get potentially 2 to 5 more inches over the weekend, which is not welcome at this point. That's going to be too much rain. We're trying to get out in the field to do a bunch of work. We're going to look at pruning, tomato pruning, and a little bit about trellising today. So it's kind of halting some of that work, but lots of replanting and bed flipping that needs to happen. We're actually pretty well caught up here at SoSUCO. It's my home farm, Fangwater Farm, that's a little behind on everything, unfortunately. But I kind of expected that here, managing this quarter-acre farm. I knew it was going to take a lot of my time, so that was to be expected. So we did get another inch of rain last night. I can go ahead and flip, or maybe I can't flip, but here's the water gauge right here. It looks like we got a little bit more than an inch. So we're forecasted to get quite a bit more, and we will be well caught up on our water year back to normal after this weekend and through this extended week of rain. It's probably a good thing ultimately, because July and August typically tend to be very dry months. So we'll take this rain when we can get it. And in fact, I'm looking at our typical ponding areas out there, and we're not seeing ponding because I have a feeling the ground, the soil moisture is right where it needs to be. So I'm not seeing too much ponding right now. Lots of stuff happening here at the farm. We've been donating tremendous amounts of produce over the past couple months from the high tunnel now out in the field. Really transitioning away from the height of spring cropping to getting into some of this warm season stuff, although a lot of the warm season crops are pretty well established at this point. I'm going to talk a little bit about pruning and trellising of tomatoes today. This was a request from one of our Master Urban Farmer trainees. So we're going to do that really quick, try to get this posted today and get that out to those who need it. All right, we can briefly talk about indeterminate production in here. I could spend a whole vlog just talking about pruning, training, and trellising. But we are pretty much caught up here in the high tunnel with our indeterminates and determinates. So this will kind of be a finished product of what it looks like, and then when we see what needs to be done in terms of pruning, training, and trellising in the field, we're going to catch up to this. So we're well on our way in here. In fact, we've been harvesting some cherries. They're starting to ripen up a little bit over the past couple weeks. Just a handful here, handful there. Same thing with some of the miniature cucumbers. We're starting to get some cucumber action, but we'll talk about those in another episode. But in here, what we have is this 35-foot row of all indeterminate slicer globe style tomatoes with one ox heart sort of Roma style tomato. We have a little half row of these very tall cherries and a little 5-foot and 2-foot section of cherries down on the other end. So most of the tomatoes in here are indeterminate tomatoes. So there's 2 different types of tomatoes. There is a semi-determinate, but primarily we stick to the indeterminate varieties and then the determinate varieties. And we both prune, train, and trellis those completely different. I mean, there are some similarities in pruning at the start, which we'll discuss. But once you get beyond that stage, the pruning and trellising are completely different between the two. What we're seeing here are more commercial options, especially for trellising. For homeowners and gardeners, home gardeners, typically you'd want to stick to the smaller tomato cages for something like a determinate. Okay, so this is a greenhouse determinate variety we're trialing here. This is BHN 589. So we're running just a little trial to see how this performs in here. And we'll demonstrate the pruning technique when we get out, but this is a basket weave. I just put on these extenders for these posts, and these are about 5 feet high at this point, and we're getting some really nice green fruit set in here, probably still, a couple weeks away from these starting to ripen up. but the determinants put on a very set amount of growth and a set number of flowering clusters that you see here. So eventually these will stop. They will pollinate, fruit set, and then they'll gradually ripen over a multiple week period, and then they will be done. So these are a different pruning and different trellising technique. And if for the home gardener, this would be a better tomato for like a smaller basket. I'm sorry, a smaller tomato cage. So the typical kind of almost canonical pyramid, reverse pyramid shaped tomato cages you buy from the store. A determinate would do fine with a little bit of initial pruning in something like that. However, the indeterminate varieties that you see here will not perform well in those typical tomato cages. You would need to get a very large tomato cage that you might build out of construction meshing or very large scale meshing that would be 2 to 3 foot in diameter and 5-6 feet in height in order to contain indeterminate. And even then you would have to do very heavy pruning of the indeterminates in order to keep them within those large tomato cages. Typically indeterminates, as they're grown here in a greenhouse and even outdoors, are pruned and then trained to 1 to 2 vertical stems. So you can see along this whole row here, we've done very intensive pruning of the suckers in here, and on most of these we've left either 1 or 2 stems that we're now training vertically. So let me find a good example of what that looks like. So here is at the base, let's see here. Here's a decent example right here. So this is, I believe, Dark Star. So this is a purple hybrid heirloom slicer. You can see we're getting some decent fruit set here. So this started off here at the bottom as we train this to the first Y. So this up to the first sucker that you see here, and then the main stem. And then we have subsequently continued just to train those 2 vines. So as you see here, when we move up towards the top, it's just those 2 vines that we have trained to these strings up to this trellising infrastructure that you see here. And these are actually 2 different types of lowered and leaning training aids. We're not actually doing too much. We're doing some lowering, but not leaning in this tunnel. This is a toma hook and then a roller hook. But you can also just tie the string to a wire, or if you, in your high tunnel like you see over there, you can just tie the string to the purlin infrastructure. So here we're just training these all vertically, and we were caught up on the sucker pruning, but you can see here, if you look closely enough, between the main leaf branches and the main stem, there were suckers here at each of these points. And with indeterminates, you are pruning out every single one of those suckers along those stems, those main stem or vines that you're keeping for your tomatoes. And we're using string here, and we're using, in some cases we're wrapping it around, but in other cases, when that's not feasible, especially when they get really big and sturdy like this, you don't want to risk breaking the stem. We're just using these tomato clips that hook into the string and then hook around a branch in the main stem to kind of give it its main support. And there's some other stuff in here. We'll do another kind of mini vlog at some point about just the indeterminates, but this is how we would do it commercially inside of a high tunnel, and how they do it typically in greenhouses. So we have the vertical training and then some form of basket weaving. And the same thing you can see here with the cucumbers. We're kind of doing the same technique. You can see some of the cucumbers starting to form fruit. So we'll talk about those at a later date. But taking advantage of the vertical space in the high tunnel is really important. So that's kind of what it looks like. Here's a little bit about, here's some of the tomato trellising twine. So this is specific grow twine for trellising tomatoes. You could use jute twine or some other string material. You don't necessarily have to use this. A lot of people like to use the compostable jute twine or other compostable twines because you end up throwing this away. This is just poly twine essentially. So it isn't exactly the most sustainable use of string, but it's really strong and it doesn't risk breaking mid-year, which is why I like to use it, whereas some of the compostable twines, in my experience, have not held up as well as these plastic-based twines. So there are a few options with that. here are the tomato clips. Here's what those look like. These come in compostable forms too. If you're careful and you harvest these at the end of the year, you can reuse them for a season or two, but eventually those break. And then these are little tomato truss support. So we'll look at this later. This hooks around the vine, and then the tomato clusters to provide the big tomatoes a little bit extra support. So we'll talk about some of this a little bit later, but I figured I'd show you that while we're in here. But I do want to show you these special tomato pruning shears. So these are nice, especially for greenhouse work, because they fit around your fingers, and so you can kind of have hands free while holding on to them, and then use them to actually make some pruning cuts. So let's go look outside where we have a lot of pruning to do. The tomatoes have really taken off, as you can see here. This is a whole row, or half row, or quarter row of indeterminates that need heavy pruning. And today, so one of the things to remember too is that there is some sanitation with your clips, and then also considering the weather conditions. If it's too humid or the plants are still pretty wet, you do run some risk of disease spread and disease carryover if you have some diseased plants. I'm not seeing any real symptoms of disease issues yet. In fact, I'm actually going to spray a biological fungicide today, which is essentially another bacterium that is beneficial that I'll spray on the leaves that would outcompete any potential plant pathogenic fungal or bacterial issues. But we'll talk more about that later. But you know, you do run that risk. But these have established really nicely, and the indeterminates and determinates are growing like crazy. The peppers have established nicely. The eggplant under the netting. Then we have some more cucurbits, and we've got a few more warm season successions yet to come. But this is kind of the state that we're at right now. So lots of pruning that needs to be done. In fact, we're a little bit behind. We have our drip installed, some of our landscape fabric installed. This is the determinate basket weaving trellising installed. So a ton of pruning work to be done. I'm going to do a little bit today, but I'm not going to probably get caught up until next week. And for all the indeterminates, we are going to run along a full 40-foot version of that raised bed trellising. So you see the verticals over there. We're going to have, it'll essentially be 4 T-posts we'll put in place with vertical 3/4 inch PVC, and then a 3/4 PVC running down the top of it all the way down the length, and then we'll train all of that vertically with string for the indeterminates like we do in the high tunnels. And we'll see a picture of that later. The problem that you run into pretty quickly, and you can start to see a little bit of this already, is that you get, we'll be able to find the main stem here. These are a bunch of cherry tomatoes. But what you run into is that now that they've grown over like this, you can see the adventitious roots here along the stems. They may start growing into the soil and making a connection point with the soil. So you can see down here, here's some adventitious roots starting to grow. And it's not a huge deal, but you start to have some sort of horizontal vining growth on the ground when really all of these need to be up more vertical. And then you can also see they're laying down, and they're starting that apical dominance is starting to, that phototropism is starting to push them back up. So you get some vertical growth or horizontal growth along the ground, and then vertical growth, and it kind of messes with your whole training and trellising system. So you need to do this as early as possible. This is definitely a little late to be doing this, but we'll still make it work. We planted all of these tomatoes on May 26th, so that's pretty standard. Maybe a week late than most outdoor, but a month later, 6 weeks later than our tomatoes in the tunnel. As you can see, there's a huge difference in these than the tunnel tomatoes. So, the pruning needs to kind of happen more timely. It should have maybe happened a week ago or started a week ago. You definitely want to wait till they become established. These tomatoes were kind of some pretty medium to poor quality transplants, but they did eventually establish, and now they're off to the races. So as soon as they get established and start greening up would be the time, especially for indeterminates, that you would start wanting to prune. So here, here's the whole row of determinates that we haven't started with yet. But you can see here that these aren't nearly as thick and lush as some of the indeterminates in the row. So I'll go ahead and set this tripod up, and hopefully we can get a good view of pruning one of these. So let me just go ahead and get this establishing shot set up, and you'll be able to see kind of what I'm doing here. So we'll kind of focus in on this plant here. Okay, hopefully we'll be able to capture all this. And you can see there's a bit of a mess here, but I can trace back down to the bottom. Here's where the main stem is, and I can already see where most of the suckers are. So I can see some of the first flowering clusters up here. The first one's actually right here. So right away for this determinate variety, I know what I have to do. I'm going to prune out all of these big main suckers. You can see I just prune those right out with my shears, and these are really big ones. I even see one that's kind of coming from the base of the plant. I'm going to prune that out too. Here's one more, two more. And then actually there's one really big one right here. There's one big one right here. And then I can see the first flowering cluster. So this is going to be, actually here's one and then two. That's a big one. You might be kind of scared to remove that one, but it's okay. And then here's the first flowering cluster. So I've removed all of the suckers and even some of these weird looking leaves all the way up to the first flowering cluster. In fact, I'll remove that one too. And then you can see here, I'll leave this sucker, this big sucker right here. And then any of the other suckers that are up here, I'm going to leave those in place. And so I removed that much material. As you can see here, it's quite a bit from that determinate plant. And that's what I'm going to be leaving behind. Okay? So for determinates, it's pretty straightforward. You prune all of the suckers up to the first flowering cluster, okay? And then you have this strong Y that you see here. Here's the Y shape that you establish, and then you just kind of let it go from there. And then we'll use the post here and do the basket weaving to pull the plant material up into kind of a hedgerow of determinate tomatoes. And then we'll just continue basket weaving until we get to the tops of these posts, and then we'll probably put some extenders up here. And these determinates won't get much higher than this T-post. This is about a 5-foot high T-post with about 4-foot stakes that will extend. So that's all we really do for determinates. And that's kind of the trellising technique. And I'll probably show you what that looks, well, you saw what it looked like in the high tunnel, but we'll see that completed at the end. So from here all the way to that T-post, that's all we're gonna do in terms of pruning for the determinates. In fact, that'll be probably the first thing I do today before I leave. Now for these indeterminates, you can already see that this is just a dense forest of vegetation at this point. So these are in need of some serious rescuing. I won't get to all of it today, but I'm going to do a little bit. So I can already tell we're running into some of those issues. So you can see here, this stem that's already touched the ground, this is pretty much grown into the soil. In fact, if I pull it up a little bit, you can see all those adventitious roots already forming here. You know, really this whole plant should already be pretty well vertical like you see here. But you can see this curved growth is already growing the opposite direction. But eventually when we get the trellising infrastructure in, it will straighten out, but this needs some serious cleaning up to do. So we can just kind of go through it. So this is one plant here at the bottom. So we'll just take it through just this whole first plant that you see right here. So you can see some major suckers to remove here at the bottom. Okay, so I've already established that this is the main stem growing up. So every major growth point off of that is going to be a sucker at this point. Okay, so I'm working my way up, and any of these kind of weird leaves I'm going to remove too, just in case. You know, and the earlier you do this, the better. I mean, by waiting until this stage, it becomes much more labor intensive to do this. So you move very slowly per per plant just to kind of remove all of this. So you can see already I've just gone only halfway up the plant, and look at all that plant material I've already removed. Now again, don't get scared, because you know, there's, for these indeterminates, they're going to keep on doing this throughout the year, and it's going to be your job to train it to those 1 or 2 stems. So don't be afraid to remove this material. So here, this is kind of, we established the strong Y down here at the bottom. Now I'm going to just kind of keep following these 2 stems, and I'm going to prune out even some of these big ones above the strong Y. Might need to stand this up a little bit. So you can see here, this is where it starts to kind of grow back. So it's all laying down, those growth tips are growing vertical, and when I pull it up the way it's eventually going to be, you can see that they're kind of growing horizontally. That'll correct itself, but the earlier you do this, the better. So I'm just going to keep it laid down. Just keep pruning out all of these suckers that you see here. So it's a lot. And again, the earlier the better, because the longer you wait, the more labor intensive this becomes. You know, and off of some of these suckers, sometimes there might be some flowering clusters that you can prune back to. In this case right here, these leaves, I'm going to just do this to 2 right now. You can see some of these leaves are starting to crisscross. So I'm going to remove a couple of those. I don't want to remove too many of these upper leaves, because this is where all the photosynthesis is happening. But that's pretty decent up to this point. So here's kind of a spot. There's 2 along the main stem. There's a really thick sucker growing. I'll leave this flowering cluster here, but I'm going to remove where my thumb is, that sucker right there. So I'm going to go ahead and prune that out, remove that. And that's probably where I'll leave this for now. So you can see we've done a decent amount of pruning. Kind of kept those 2 main stems up here to the top, and we're going to probably train this to those 2 stems at this point. Okay, you see I kind of pulled it off of the soil right there. There is some of those adventitious roots that are forming. This is, you don't want this, because this, if you have any soil pathogens that could affect the plant, you know, this splash up and soil on here could cause an issue. So I'm going to probably spray this with that biological fungicide and keep a close eye on these, because these already pretty much should be starting to be trellised and trained vertically. So again, just another reason to get on top of this. So you can see the difference here between this indeterminate that's been pruned and then all these others that I still have yet to do. Okay, so this is a pretty long video, just like the last one, but I just wanted to give you a feel for what that looks like. So you're going to be removing a lot of material, remember. For the indeterminates, you're pruning to a single vertical stem or 2 vertical stems, depending on your trellising. And then remember, for the determinates, you're pruning up all the suckers up to the first flowering cluster, and then form that strong Y here, and then pretty much leave everything else, and then you'll just basket weed them or cage them. One other note, I mentioned some sanitation with the pruning shears. You might want to have a little cup of alcohol or bleach solution that, you know, between plants that you're dipping in. I actually have some of these alcohol wipes here that I'm just going to have out in the field with me, and I'm just going to kind of, between plants and varieties, just wipe this off to kind of sanitize those a little bit. But that's one thing to consider, especially if you do have some disease issues on your plants that you might want to avoid. Okay, so hopefully your tomatoes don't quite look like this and they're very overgrown. Hopefully you've been keeping up on this, but just wanted to show you a little bit about some pruning techniques here at Sosuco. All right, we'll catch everyone next time.